Thank you so much. I love seeing the dynamic of like, health policy, and then we have like medical, we have biological science, like it's all kind of comes together to form these solutions. And as we encounter them, as the world changes around us, we need to come up with newer ones. And I think education is one of the spaces as well, where we're constantly trying to think of new ways of how it can best optimize for human flourishing. And I think Sarah is going to talk a little bit about her work and how she shares God's love through education.
Awesome. Thanks, Cheryl. I'm really excited to kind of share with you guys about just God's design and how we pull out that desire, that passion, the potential that we have in us that was given by God in the space of education. And so for me, one of the big things I always come back to when I think about education and what we do is Genesis 1. When God created man in its own image, it says that he created males and females and God blessed them. And the command that God gave to people is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it. And as I kind of think about these verses as like the core foundation of what we were created to do, who we were created to be, I go back to how God asked people not only to fill the earth but have dominion over it. And one of the first things that Adam and Eve did was to name all creatures, which for me, it's like that creativity and that freedom that God has given people to make up names for themselves and really just rule over what God has created. So it's not just, so like I believe, in a God who doesn't just like dictate what we need to do, but rather give us freedom to flourish and to be creative and kind of play with God has given us as that kind of playground. And so for me, when I think about what God has done for us and the way that he has created humans, I always go back to, where has God placed all of us in various spheres? And we often talk about, places of cultural influence. And earlier, some of our panelists, I talked, especially those in science, we talked a lot about science and different fields. And I think there's going to be another talk coming up about, business and the space of economics. And these are all like influential aspects of the world that create culture, that shape our understanding, shape our worldviews. And for me personally, I am in this education space, particularly education research, and I look at entrepreneurship education and 21st century skills at the secondary and university level, because I always go back to this quote where it says, education is often the arena where the war is most fiercely waged for the hearts and minds of the emerging generation. And then truly, if we think about the school system from preschool all the way to K-12 and to universities, that's a place where students, young people are encountering various worldviews there, and it's the place where they're able to really grow and nurture. And I actually spent a lot of time working and consulting in the Middle East, and something I do appreciate kind of as like a side note, when they think about education policies and Ministry of Education, they don't just talk about it in education, but the Arabic word they use is nurturing. It's like education and nurturing. So from even a lot of my work, I think about education as a place where individuals are nurtured and their potential becomes unleashed. They identify what they're good at, what their talents are, and the ways that they've been designed and wired to thrive in this world. And as an educator, I still believe that one of my biggest roles is to help young people identify what their talents are, what their giftings are, what they're good at, what their interests are, so that they're able to select a path where they can thrive and be confident about who they are and get and go forth. And so if I think about education, the way that and a lot of my research actually revolves around entrepreneurship education and creative education, design thinking. So and a lot of the things that I do, whether it's working with edtech companies and trying to implement edtech in schools, or examine how incubators, accelerators at the university level, or entrepreneurship programs at the secondary level help students think and prototype and design ideas and envision things. the question I always come back to for me personally, as I work in, non-faith-based spaces, is what does it mean to unlock God's design and purpose through education, as someone who really believes that all humans were created in the image of God, which means that if we are to be reflect the image of God, that means the creativity that God had to create the heavens and the earth is in us. The freedom God had and the knowledge and the intelligence God has, he's given that to us. So I constantly think about, okay, what does it mean to unlock this in the sphere of education? And so I always go back to this verse as well in Ecclesiastes, where it says he has made everything beautiful in its time. It's also set eternally in the human heart, and no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to end. Yes, of course, as humans, we're limited and we can't comprehend God. And some people question, and whether, where is God in the picture, or does God even exist? But I do believe, as a person of faith, that God has made everything beautiful, and he has set eternity in our human hearts. And part of the reason why so many of us, especially I'm at Stanford right now, and a lot of people in Silicon Valley are builders and creators, and we're encouraged to think new ideas, try things out. And I think part of that is because God has set eternity in our human heart. There's this hunger for something more, something new, something creative. So that's different. That's more, because we're all meant to kind of contribute to building of a wider kingdom of God for eternity. So I think about, okay, if that's all been there, if God's given us all these tools and all these skills and this energy, what does it mean to unlock it? And a lot of it also goes back, and we see from, Exodus all the way back, where God is the one, by filling people with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, knowledge, and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in every craft. And I don't think this is just limited to people who believe in a God, but it's for all people, because he is someone who has created and formed every single person from the foundations of earth from birth. So as I think about my research, and a lot of my research around entrepreneurship education, 21st century learning, I spend a lot of time thinking about, what does it mean to help students understand problem solving? How do we teach perseverance? How do we teach critical thinking? How do we teach creativity and allow foster environments for collaboration and allow students to have self-efficacy? And as I think about these values and these buzzwords that we hear a lot about in education spaces, about how do we embed education, I think for me, it becomes a question of, hold on, it's been pretty recent since I made this connection, as I was doing a lot more research. As the more I research, and ironically in academia, the more I kind of think about, how do we teach perseverance and grit? So that's such like a key buzzword. We need to have students have perseverance. How do we have students be creative? And a lot of that creativity research tells us it requires like a safe space and a safe learning environment where people are able to try things and not be afraid to fail, and have self-efficacy, that kind of confidence to go on. And as I think about these values and these principles that are so foundational, soft skills for success, I often come back to, it's kind of funny, but I always come back to, like, how do I teach about perseverance or being rooted in identity in who God says you are? Like when I teach small group and in Bible study, and I actually end up bringing a lot of those principles into kind of teaching a wider audience, into even my own research about building self-efficacy and perseverance, because I realized so much of it happens when people, and a lot of what I'm finding in my dissertation research right now, is those who are a lot more confident, who are a lot more creative, who are a lot more able to persevere more, but to think beyond the box even more, are people who have a deep sense of identity, who they are. And as I interview all these people who are like, where and how did you get this idea to kind of start new things, or even enter an entrepreneurship program as an 18, 19-year-old and just kind of go for it? And the more I talk to people, whether they're of faith or not, something that I discover and I'm finding is that they are people and they're individuals who are very much rooted in who they are. They're people who know themselves and actually do not put confidence in their own abilities, I think a lot of times the world says, your worth is based off of performance and how much you make. But for these people, their sense of worth for themselves isn't based on performance, but it's more based on knowing who they are and knowing that they have been created for a purpose. And that when they articulate these things, and this is kind of like what my research is finding, actually echoes God's heart. Because God is like, no, like before anything else, like in a lot of identity in the Christian faith, it's about how God's like, no, I've called you righteous, I've called you good, I've called you my child, I've called you who I say I am. And it's that identity that drives us to walk confidently, and knowing that we're loved. It's like that's what leads us to really know that we're able to walk confidently in this world. And so I realized those principles apply in like non-faith traditions or non-faith contexts as well. And so for me, a lot of my research has shifted in kind of having these conversations, and even in my findings is, oh, it really goes back to a sense of self and knowing that their value doesn't come from performance, or their value doesn't come from a place of trying to find validation for others, but being rooted in who they believe they are meant to be and helping people discover how they've been wired, whether, so that's kind of become the focus. And I think that's the brilliance of that beauty that God has kind of revealed a little bit of himself and his heart for the world, even through education, in the ways that we're kind of talking about it in this day. Like, what are these big topics that people talk about outside of issues of like equity and injustice and diversity? A lot of these like new century skills for learning, and even individualized learning, how we're trying to personalize learning, and needs to be a lot more humanizing, and things need to be transferable. And some things that get often quoted and spoken around within the education space is that we might have a lot in common, but we're never intended to be carbon copies of each other. And there's a movement in education reform away from like an industrial model of education to more personalized learning that focuses on the sense of self. And it's easy to get into a place of like narcissism, or it goes too much of like catering everything for one person. But I think at the core of it, what this desire and this shift in education is reflecting is the fact that, subconsciously, unconsciously, I think there is that hunger that people have, knowing that we're meant for something more, meant to be more than just like workers and laborers who are producers, but that there is an individual design. And for me, that just reflects how God has formed us uniquely and designed us uniquely to fulfill a purpose. And so as an educator, as someone who does a lot of education research in these domains of like entrepreneurship, creativity, and soft skills development, as someone who also teaches and interacts with a lot of students, what I kind of take with me always is kind of think about, okay, what is that design that God has made? How has God wired people? And how do I help people kind of think out of the box and really root themselves in who they are, and what their kind of core identity is in terms of what makes them thrive, what their interests are, what they're good at, so they can find that sweet spot to thrive. And I think that's kind of the work where education has been moving. And I'm just really thankful that I'm able to kind of bring in a lot of my faith and kind of see how a lot of these principles in the heart of God is actually reflected in current education systems and the reform movements. And so that's like an encouragement for me. And I think that's, as like the more we think about like God's heart and the identity that he has given us, and approach education with a consciousness and the understanding that everyone's been wired differently and formed in a very worthy way, allow us to approach education and the way that we deal with students and the way that we treat students, interact with students in a way that's a lot more humanizing and respectful, so that they are able to really discover from themselves and thrive. So I'm going to stop here for the sake of time, but also kind of open up for questions that we might have, and just kind of end on this note that, what really drives us and the biggest biblical value that I'm able to bring into the education space is that so much of teaching embodies grace. that exudes respect, compassion, and empathy. And many teachers do give personal sacrifices, and it's when you give grace to students and young people to make mistakes and try again and make them believe that they belong. We know from research that's where people are able to thrive. So I think it's that grace that we come back to. So that's kind of, yeah, so that's where I'm going to leave, and then I'm happy to answer questions and continue on. So thank you.
It's like I would say, it's hard to not see God in everything after seeing and hearing all of these talks. All right, so we'll open it up for questions.
Sure, Sarah, I have a question, and as a fellow educator, I was so excited to hear what you were saying. You talked about the fact that we know that we're meant for more. So how does that impact the way you work to unlock God's design and purpose in people, in students with whom you interact, even though they may not believe in God?
Yeah, so that's kind of the way that I approach students. So I actually spend a lot of time coaching students one-on-one, and before I've worked on teacher leadership development programs with teachers. So the ways that I counsel and coach and teach, especially in small group context or one-on-one, I sit down with them and really have them think about, like, what are some things that you love doing in your free time? Like, what are things that kind of make you tick? And help them kind of think through those things and actually map it out and lay it out. And what I discover often, especially when working with college students or high school students, a lot of them are kind of driven towards what they've been told to do, or what they think is successful in the ways of this world, and haven't actually had the time to step back and reflect and be a little more introspective and really kind of hear their own hearts. And I do believe God's always having a spiritual conversation with people, even if they don't know them. So I invite them just to be like, hey, just sit and just be honest with yourself. Like, what is it that you really love doing, or what makes you tick or thrive? And I think from that place, we begin there, whether it's career coaching or even in thinking about prototyping or product, kind of designing products. And I found that actually helps people kind of find that sweet spot and be like, oh yeah, I think this is what I've been meant to be doing. And it gives them excitement and more motivation to continue on. So I found that to be really helpful.
Sarah, I'm really appreciated your talk, and that question answered the part for the student interaction, but I was also wondering on a peer level. It seems like what you're saying is so contagious, and do you meet others who resonate with you, or even they could be from other faiths, but have you had that opportunity to engage and just get, are you finding agreement on some of what you shared?
Yeah, I actually find a lot of agreement in what I've shared. I think part of it's because our generation right now, it's so big on authenticity.
I feel like, is she frozen? She's frozen.
A lot of other people from different faiths or no faiths totally resonate, and it kind of becomes a good opener.
Very cool. I'm actually curious if people a lot of us have been in the university and school for a long time. Do people have any feedback or comments about their education experience versus what Sarah was talking about? I know for me, there was not a building. You just learned it from, everyday interactions. But I don't know if anyone reflects on their education experience with these topics.
I think that one-on-one experience or the mentorship process was the most relevant in my career, because it allowed me to find a model of who I wanted to become. I think that's kind of outside of the box of who I was supposed to be. It was finding my true self, and out of the scope of the so many options that we had to get an expertise on, finding that one thing that made us tick was the most important thing. So I think that's so important, and I think mentorship is key. It's not just a generalized education that fits everyone, but that personal level is so important.
Thank you so much, Juanita, and thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing with us about education. It's just very hopeful because we see that it's heading in a good direction.